Well, we now have our panel discussion. I would invite those panelists, please, to come up on the platform and take a seat so we can move along. While they're coming, we do have a hashtag for the event EIC, hashtag EIC12. There are about 5 people, I think, who've been tweeting during these previous sessions. The Wi-Fi here is a little slow, but it is functional. And those of you who are actually involved in social media, do feel free to social mediate as we proceed. Please come and take a seat. Okay, we're almost all here. Well, we're very glad to welcome to the platform Roy Adar, Shirief, Nosseir, and Jim Taylor. And I'm going to stand here, I think. We have time for a lively conversation now to pull together some things we've already been talking about and prep everybody for what comes next. And what was suggested was we might begin by asking the question, what is your top, most pressing privacy concern now? What is the thing that you lie awake at night worrying about most? We'll start from here. And introduce yourself first briefly so we all get around the table.
Hi, I'm Shirief Nosseir, and I work for security management solutions at Say Technologies. I work as a product marketing director in that space. So when we're looking at privacy, there's a number of things that are happening. From a technology perspective, I think there's a number of new technologies. We've seen Kim talking about cloud computing, so that's obviously an area where privacy concerns are going to be important to look at, and looking at it from in ways similar to offshoring and outsourcing and things like that. But cloud computing obviously provides a lot of challenges there that we need to be aware of. But also location-based services. This is an area that it's really starting to pick up some ground, and the implications are quite important to be able to handle, in the sense of it's not just a matter of losing personal information. It could end up with people being physically attacked because we know the location of the person, or we know the location of the deliveries that are happening and things like that. So how can we secure this information? Other areas are, for example, also big data, and how we're going to be able to collect all of this data, start to analyze it, and look at patterns of what people are doing, the behaviors of the users, how we're going to store this information, what are we going to be using it for, how we're going to communicate it to our users, and so on. So these are some technology challenges.
Let's move around, yes. Major issues on privacy. You can't repeat him. You've got to come up with the line with these children's games. You've got to have something fresh.
Something different. Okay, so I'm Jim Taylor from NetIQ. I run product management for NetIQ's identity and security solutions. So I guess, I would have the same, but if I'm not allowed to choose those, then I would add another one onto that. And one of the areas of concern that we're focused around at the moment is really the mobility of data, mobile devices, bring your own device, how to secure and manage data and information that goes onto those devices, what happens to it. Really the way, I guess I would categorize that as the changing consumption of information, and the fact that the traditional ways that we've managed information in the past are radically changing, and they're changing very quickly. So how do we deal with privacy concerns in that context?
Okay.
I'm Roy Adar, the Vice President of Product Management for Cyber-Ark Software. One of the things that we are concerned about and predict changes will happen in the next year or so are not really around the people who are concerned about their privacy and want to ensure that their private information is protected, but a lot of us, a lot of the people are happily sharing personal information. And one of the challenges that we see is that how can this information put the enterprise that employs those individuals in perhaps more danger when personal details and information about employees can be actually used by attackers to penetrate the organization. How can we map that? How can we understand the risk that we're facing as the aspect of privacy?
Security issues.
Okay, I think there are many points, and I just want to pick 3. At least 2 of them I had in my keynote, I think. So one is that we have this lack or this loss of trust I think that's one of the things. So what are the really trusted parties? And how do we deal with the fact that this has changed? The second is what I would call data leakage by design. So things we are observing in Android, which we had in iOS recently, was contact data leaking. So really catastrophic design errors, in fact, regarding privacy of data when all your contact data could flow. I think it's a very interesting point. And the third one is, I would say, let's call it traceability of data when it flows. So we had this in a session this morning. You might have your SAP HR system. You might have probably hundreds of CSV you create regularly to export data to other systems. And then you are lost. You don't know what happens with this data. And the same happens once you give away data to someone, your private data to some other party. Once it's out, you're out of control. And this, how do we stay better in control? I think it's one of the very interesting topics in enterprises and for the consumer side, where life management platforms, for example, will be a very interesting thing.
So these 7 or 8 different major sets of questions here put on the table. 2 other major questions, which, you know, draw a sort of matrix, there are various intersections here, I mean, which I'd like us to go around on. One is the question of the extent to which people are concerned about privacy, the extent to which they're going to end up being worried about, the extent to which there's a sort of numb period at the moment, which will be followed by a period in which people's feelings come back and they develop a sense of privacy in the new paradigm which will change so many things. But you know, at the moment, of course, so many of these businesses, their model depends on people not caring much about privacy, and the extent to which monetizing privacy is going to end up more as a transactional, overt, contractual relationship. And then the other question, and I'll put these out there, then we can go around on them, is of course the transatlantic question. In that, you know, in fact, we, in 1 or 2, I think you were there, in Washington, we hosted an event with Peter Hustings, you know, the European Data Privacy Supervisor, a few weeks ago in Washington. And one of the things that Peter typically says is that there is a slow progression toward convergence in the European position and the US position on privacy questions. This is something he likes to say every time I think he speaks. It may or may not be true, depends just what significance you give to these questions. But the significance of the transatlantic discussion. But first of all, I'd talk a bit about the question of monetizing privacy. Example of this, there was a very interesting thing from Google quite recently. They offered to give people vouchers of some kind if they would let them use more of their data than they normally did. Very interesting, because it was the first example, I think, of Google paying people directly, even if it was a book voucher or something. But are we going to see that sort of over-monetization? So you can, you know, pay 10 euros a month or have them use your data.
Yeah, I think overall, I think you're touching a very important point, which is what is the currency we pay? Is it money or is it privacy? And I'm currently working on a piece, and the thesis in there is that once too many parties, too many identity providers, for example, know too much about too many people, the value of these things will decrease, because this knowledge is only valuable if it either very few are sort of the monopolists, or they have a knowledge only they have. But the more parties outside more know about everyone, the less value is in it. And so I think there's a logical limit for the privacy currency. It won't work for everything. It is a very limited scale. And I think that's a very important point when you look at these things. And I've never read this in that form, but I think it's a very important point. If you look at it just from an economic perspective, there's a logical limit, because the value of this data, of the personal data, devalues the more people know about it.
Do we agree with that? Is that logic? Does it hold? Or in fact, is there something indefinite about the correlations? I don't know.
I think it's a bit of both. So definitely in a number of areas where we start getting information about people, then we'll reach a ceiling. But I think also human nature are quite different in the sense of a lot of the time the information is collected for marketing purposes and for creating profiles and putting people into these different profiles. So in certain areas, once we created these profiles, then that will be it. But as new markets start to develop and as human behavior changes as people carry on, there might be some areas where there might be opportunities to continue getting more information out of that. But personally, I'm under the point of, if we do it as a self-regulated way and just leave corporates to run their way of doing things, which is more of the US view of things, then a lot of privacy is going to be taken away from people, as opposed to more of the European perspective of being, in a way, a bit more regulated. And we've seen what's been coming out of the EU with the privacy laws that are hopefully going to be coming through soon.
What do others think? I mean, are we going to see more overt monetization of data?
So I want to come back to Martin's point and say that I think that's an interesting point, but I think one of the dynamics at the moment is that people don't really understand the value of their private data. We all go sign up for Facebook's, Google's, whatever. Everybody just ticks, I agree. A lot of the users or the consumers of a lot of these services where this information is collected don't really understand the value of the information that's being collected. So I agree with Martin's point that I think there is a limit to the value of the data, and once everybody knows it, to some extent it loses a lot of its value. But I also think that there's a growing but a very small realization of consumers of the value of that data. And I think the more we have breaches and attacks and things like that, things that are very public where we discuss and see the value of this data, I think probably everybody in this room probably understands the value of it. But I think this room probably represents 0.01% of the reality of the understanding of the general consumer. I know my teenage daughters don't have a clue. They just want to get onto the thing that they're using, they tick the box, they have no idea what that means. I think that's going to change over time. So I think the real value of that information, consumers don't really understand it at this point.
Yeah, but 2 points again, sorry. One point is, the interesting thing is I've deleted my Facebook account some 6 months ago or something. And when I created it, I have to create it after having received some 2 years ago, having received a lot of invitations. Since I deleted my Facebook account, I received exactly one invitation, and this one was a spam invitation. So obviously, in my peer group, the people who are actively inviting to Facebook are not as active anymore as they have been 2 years ago. I think that's a very, very interesting thing. It's not a statistical, a valid statistic, but it's just something I've observed. And I think the other point is, once you have real options, which are becoming increasingly popular, that also will lead to people thinking more about it. And if you look at all the discussions around Google changing its terms of conditions and all these things, it becomes a public discussion that raises awareness.
I would like to add to that some things in human nature are things that you start paying attention to after you get hurt or after you realize something, and that goes to the point of the value of my information. So as people mature into the age where they start to use computers and internet, and that's of course, tens of millions of people around the world reach the age where they start using computing, they're still, I'll call it, more innocent in providing their information. And if they get an opportunity to get more information or more games or more fun activity, and all they need to do is tell some personal details about themselves, or pay, or don't give your details but pay a subscription, a lot of people would choose to get the free service and give up their details. So that's something that it's human nature, so it will continue to happen.
Well, let me ask you, because it has puzzled me personally why, over this last decade, when all this has been happening, none of these major services has offered a subscription alternative with sort of heavy-duty privacy, anonymity are fixed. I mean, Facebook could be saying $10 a month and we won't keep anything. We won't read anything. You keep it all. None of them's done that. Do you know, why haven't they even tried to do that? Are they scared? Do they think, I don't know.
I think when you look at Facebook, maybe it's because their software platform is so difficult to change that they just couldn't do it. If you look at how long it takes them to make a fix they have to do regarding privacy, probably that's their problem, that they're just not able to do it based on their platform. The other thing is, as long as a business model works pretty well, like the one of Google, maybe they don't have the pressure to do it. And it will be very interesting maybe in the next years to see, once there are real alternatives, how they react. So will they then be able to change their models, or are they too late? Because that's, I think, the really interesting point. Once there's an alternative, are the others able to change or not?
I would add that the business model of ratings, so the more rating you can show the advertisers, the more ads you can sell and at higher prices, has been around for tens of years. And start with TV and newspapers,
yes,
and common websites. Yeah. So that's a mature tens of years of maturity of a business model, which is hard for companies to ignore or give up on.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting way of looking at it. Let's talk about this transatlantic question, because I think this is another of the sort of big fissures across every one of these conversations. And obviously, the major companies here have been US companies. The US has a very different approach to regulation in general, particularly once you get outside the telecoms and so on. There's just not been that development here. And from my point of view, I suppose I've seen Europe as the kind of regulator of last resort, because European muscles have been flexed and American companies have been scared, and this has been a process. Now, how is this looking? Is it getting better? Is there more harmony breaking out here? Or do we see real problems down the road, not least for investors and for those who have a stake in these industries? Who wants to pick up?
So I will.
Yeah.
So I think the real answer is a bit of both, unfortunately. I think there is no true answer to that. I think there is definitely a sign of convergence. I'm a European that lives and works in the US. I deal with a lot of US companies. I also spend a fair amount of time in Europe. As the global economy develops, I mean, we see so many companies in Europe dealing with things like Sarbanes-Oxley, things like that. There is a lot of cross-border regulation now. So I think I would agree and say that there is convergence in regulation, but I don't necessarily see it as by design, or it's more really to suit a purpose. It's by desire. So I think convergence is happening, but it's happening more in spite of itself rather than a focused, driven, successful
approach. And is it happening then sort of proportionately? That is to say, the number of issues, the amount of money, these things are all going up. I mean, are things actually net getting better?
I would say they're probably staying about the same.
Okay. Great stasis. Well, we can keep having conferences talking about the same thing. Martin?
Yeah, I think there are some aspects we have to look at. And one is, I think, in the US, we look at it from a European perspective as a pretty monolithic thing, but I think it isn't. So I think there's the aspect which is more the homeland security part in the US, where it's really about what is seen as a risk to the US as a state. And I think there's a other perception than when it comes to privacy and the business. So and we tend to, I think, from a European perspective, to mix up these things a little bit too much, maybe. I think that's a point where we might need to differentiate a little bit more, because it's not everything the same. And then I think the other point is that in tendency, I think the US tends to trust a little bit more in the, let's say, in the markets. So market will regulate things over time more than the Europeans do. So US also regulates, but the European always tends to believe more in regulations, maybe, and I think that's the point. But overall, if I look at the discussions I also have with my US colleagues, which is pretty interesting to me, because we have different views in our company. And I had this recently around the Google terms of conditions around these ignorance of privacy settings in the Internet Explorer by Facebook and others. And I think the point is not that one is privacy ignorant and the other is fully privacy sensitive. It's more, where's the borderline? And Yeah, I think that's the point where. So I think there's really some convergence over time. It's a slow one, but it's happening.
Yeah, I would like to add, if we look at the way that privacy is considered here in Europe, it's more considered as a human right, really. It's Article 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights. As opposed to, if we look in the US, privacy is more seen as a liberty, and it's more seen as a way of protecting from the government overreaching into the home. And what we need to keep in mind is there's a couple of ways that we need to be looking at privacy. There's the freedom of speech, which is the First Amendment in the US, and a lot of the time when privacy is being mentioned, the First Amendment is the thing that comes to mind. But we need to differentiate between freedom of speech and privacy in the perception of collecting information about people to be able to use it for marketing purposes. And there's a difference there. I think from a freedom of speech, I think the US is more keen on that. There's more interference from the governments here in Europe of what freedom of speech should mean. We've seen cases of Google in Italy where some executives were sentenced to 6 months of jail, although it was suspended. But something like this would definitely not happen in the US, as opposed to when we're talking about collection of private information for marketing gains. I think there's definitely a convergence, and we've just seen last month that the White House has been coming up with stuff similar to the European directive.
In the description of the session in the program, which I'm sure brought you all here, the phrase is used that dreaded bands of rogue knights robbing your privacy. This would be a certain kind of European view of certain kinds of American companies, I think. Is there really going to be a big choice to be made for us as to whether the internet essentially is a commercial enterprise in which privacy basically goes by the board, and a kind of democratically but controlled, more humane but more regulated environment? Is this a big choice we're going to face? Or do you think in 10 years' time we'll be having the same conversations? We've got about 3 minutes. Quick answers.
So as a quick answer, I would say that eventually, are you rogue or are you not rogue is a question both of kind of morality. Are you doing good or doing bad? That's one way to look at it. And it's also, are you within the law or outside of the law? And potentially majority of the sites who perhaps abuse privacy are doing it within the current capabilities that the laws provide them. So the rogue term is perhaps a bit on the judging side to people who are within the law. Now, if the laws will become more restrictive, then and still organizations will not adhere to the law, then yes, that would be a rogue.
Okay, let me just ask each of the four of you, we've got just 2 minutes, in one sentence as we wrap up, 10 years' time, is this conversation going to be pretty much the same? Will it have been resolved, or is it going to be scarier? Martin, you go first.
I think we will have different conversations, so because we will have real alternatives to today's approaches relying on consuming as much of privacy data as possible from others. I think we will have real alternatives, and that will change the discussion.
Okay.
I agree. I think the mobility and the location would really introduce completely new challenges for the next few years.
Yeah.
So I agree to some extent, but I think money is king. And if money can be made out of it, I think we'll be having similar conversations.
I exactly agree with that as well. So, yeah, we're definitely going to improve a lot, but because money is involved, there's always going to be interest in
I chaired a panel on this in Washington a couple of years ago, and the person there who was basically giving the industry view was one of the panelists. And at the end, I went around with a similar sort of question. And I said, might it not take the collapse of one of the major brands in a privacy scandal? And of course, we've had a whole series of them from Google and Facebook and so on. I said, one that just takes off, and it could have happened, and it could happen. And I said, it was a year ago, I said, like BP without the oil reserves. Because all these companies really have is brand. It's brand, it's trust, servers, that's what they have. I said, well, the collapse of one of these companies to upend the whole model and to produce privacy as the key selling proposition. Very interesting, we went on the panel with us, we had ACLU there, various people in the room, and came to the person who represented most of the industry view, and he said, I hadn't thought about that. which I thought was something of an indicator of the context of the American discussion, and I think also their lack of approach to risk management in this situation, which I think in some ways is the bottom line. So that's my last word. Thank you very much. We now have 20 minutes for refreshments. You're invited to hurry along and to hurry back so we can carry on with the program. Thank you very much indeed.